FanScape, a fan fiction podcast, presents Blood and Venom Part 2, Shattered Reality. Chapter 11. The Other Side.
A haunting, distorted, yet somewhat somber melody filled the stale, dead air of the void Lauren now found herself standing in, almost drowning out the sound of her panicked breathing.
Where the fuck am I? What is this?
She whispered, looking around frantically as she desperately tried to see anything through the darkness. The last thing she remembered was falling unconscious after being attacked by Charlie. She wasn't sure how long she'd been out for, but she'd woken up standing in the middle of whatever nightmare she'd been dragged into. A nightmare where she couldn't even see her hand in front of her face. She wasn't sure how long she'd stood there waiting for her eyes to adjust to the darkness, nor was she sure if they actually did, or if the void itself grew slightly brighter. But eventually, she was able to make out her immediate surroundings. Blanketing everything in sight, which consisted of little more than burned trees and glowing patches of smoldering embers, was a sea of ash that she'd initially mistaken for snow due to the frigid temperatures. It was obvious to her that she was standing on the summit where she'd fought through the forest fire, but no stars were visible in the pitch-black sky, if there even was a sky, and she could no longer see the glowing red light of the radio tower, for it too had been devoured by the all-encompassing void. Something was horribly wrong with this place. Something aside from the impenetrable darkness and stale air, the eerie sounds echoing all around her, and the fact that the fire should have still been raging on. An overpowering sense of dread had completely engulfed her, a feeling identical to what Carl had felt at the Matheson farm.
This isn't right.
Lauren muttered, unsure of what she was witnessing. Her surroundings looked so similar to where she'd been only minutes before, but it was obvious to her that whatever this place was, it wasn't the same location.
You should really be careful about looking into the abyss for too long. It might start looking back at you.
A chill ran up Lauren's spine at these words, not only because she recognized the observer's cruel, warped voice from when she'd met him in Oakside Park, but because there was now an overpowering sense of familiarity to it. For a more human element now accompanied the sinister tone, an element that she remembered from long ago. When she turned to face the collective's leader, who she could now see clearly in the pitch-black void, she felt her heart sink at the sight of him. For the impenetrable shadows that usually engulfed the observer had receded, revealing a familiar face to her. He was 30 years old, African-American, clean-shaven, and had dark hair that was shorter than the last time Lauren had seen him, but his style hadn't changed much, for he wore baggy dark gray cargo shorts, a black collared t-shirt, and black hiking boots. However, what hit Lauren the hardest was how his rectangular glasses now glowed white with malice, and how a sinister, bloodthirsty smile was present on his face, a look she never would have seen on the man he'd once been.
Kevin?
She gasped, hardly able to form words. Kevin Haas had been a classmate of hers while she'd been going to college in Florida, someone she'd considered a good friend in those days. More importantly, he'd been like a brother to the man she'd fallen in love with, the man who'd always been there for her before she'd left him behind to pursue her career, the man who'd given her the black necklace that she still wore, the man who she wanted more than ever to make things right with, who'd looked like he'd been through a war the last time she'd seen him, who she'd thought of after seeing that billboard with the boardwalk on it, and while gazing at the beautiful view on the ridge. A man named Noah Maxwell.
Close!
The observer chuckled, still smiling with demented glee.
Honestly, Lauren, I'm really impressed you've managed to make it this far. There aren't many who can say they've done the same.
His voice was sounding more like Kevin's by the second, but it still carried that warped, unhinged tone, as if it wasn't really the man she'd once known,
I don't understand.
Really? After all you've seen, all you've accomplished, this is what stumps you? Come on, Lauren. You're smarter than that. I possess this body, you idiots! With the glowing white eyes not enough of an indication? What about the fact that I can transform Gavin here into a fucking show demon? For a smart lady, you really are stupid!
Go to hell.
Look around you! We're already there.
He said with a grin, holding his arms wide open.
So?
He began, beginning to pace around.
Aren't you going to ask me what you're doing here? Why I'm possessing Kevin of all people? What's really been going on this whole time?
With how much you've been monologuing already, I didn't think I'd have to.
She responded, her voice full of venom. The shock of seeing Kevin in this state had subsided, and now she felt rage burning within her. The observer laughed loudly for a moment, pointing at her with an amused expression on his face.
Man! I'm liking you more and more by the minute. Just between me and you, I was rooting for you. When you clapped Mr. High and Mighty across the face with that branch, seeing him go apeshit like that was more satisfying than you'll ever know!
Wait, what?
Lauren questioned, surprised by his statement.
I thought you monsters liked working for him.
Oh, we enjoy our work, but the boss himself can be rather unforgiving. In any case, he doesn't pay us to like him.
Something tells me he doesn't pay you at all.
How right you are!
The observer grumbled, an irritated expression momentarily appearing on his face before his signature grin returned.
Anyway, that's not why we're here. We're here because of you, Lauren, and I mean that quite literally. All of the pain and suffering, all of the trauma we put your friends through, everything that's led up to this point. It's all been for you.
Seeing that Lauren was waiting for him to go on, he smirked at her and continued.
You didn't think that you were just caught in the crossfire, did you? That you just happened to get sucked into whatever was going on with Kate and Carl? Think of how we lured you in. How we've been toying with you this entire time. Doesn't it all seem a little too deliberate? Doesn't it seem like we've been focusing on you a little too much?
I don't know, asshole, you tell me.
Lauren said, watching in annoyance as the observer cackled and started talking again.
Well, in that case, the answer is yes! You were right to think you were the epicenter of everything because you are. You were right to think that none of this made any sense because it wasn't supposed to. Like in Oakside Park. Did you really think that making you run around an empty campground to find pieces of paper was just our idea of a fun little game? That stopping your little friend from killing you in those mines was us giving you a second chance? That showing you what happened to Charlie was only meant to scare you? No! No! It was all meant to confuse you. Keep you distracted and wondering about inconsequential things while we worked in the background to get to this point. We manipulated every action you took, tore your psyche apart little by little, piece by piece. And now here you are, ripe for the picking just like we planned. It is not like you were hard to manipulate either. All it took was a scream that wasn't even Kate's to bring you running right into our farmhouse.
What the hell are you talking about?
Come on, Lauren. Don't you think it was just a little too coincidental that you heard Kate scream at just the right time? From just far enough away for you to know where she was? That's because it wasn't her. It was our keeper mimicking her voice to lure you in. Kate was ours long before you even got to her house, although I'm sure you know that, thanks to Firebrand and his little detour with the videotapes. I'm not sure what he thought showing you that footage would accomplish, but it hardly matters now.
So it was Firebrand who left those there.
Lauren muttered. As much as she hated everything that she was hearing, it was all making sense to her.
Oh, yes. He's been a thorn in our side for some time now, and this little game we've been playing is no exception. His tenacity has proven troublesome, and his abilities have evolved into something quite formidable. But he is a fool playing a losing game. Sooner or later, we will take him, just like we're going to take you.
If this was always about me, then why the fuck did my friends have to suffer? Why didn't you just come after me and leave them out of it?
You watched those tapes, Lauren? You already know the answer. Carl Ross was the only one of you dumb enough to come looking for us on his own. And surprise, surprise, he bit off more than he could chew. The dumbass got what was coming to him, in my opinion. As for Cathryn, well, she's a different story. We were punishing those filthy bloodlines long before either of you were in the picture. So imagine our surprise when we started making plans. Looked ahead and saw that the two of you would become friends. After that, the plan changed. We let things play out naturally, and when the time came, we went after her, too. When we lured her into that old park in Michigan, that wasn't just us having fun. It was meant to get the ball rolling. We knew it would drive a wedge between the two of you, make her move away from everything she'd ever known to keep you safe from us. We also knew you would feel guilty for how you two grew apart, and how that guilt would eventually bring you to where you are now. After putting the plan into motion, it became a waiting game. And when the time was right, we dangled your friends in front of you like a worm on a hook. And sure enough, you took the bait. It's funny how little effort it took from us in the grand scheme of things. How so much of it just worked itself out. I couldn't have planned it better myself!
So this whole time, you've just been using my friends to get to me?
Lauren stammered, horrified by what she was hearing.
You've been manipulating our whole lives?
Yeah, more or less.
The observer smirked.
Hell, even that fella you worked for, Russell Parker, he played a big part in all of this without even realizing it.
The grinning entity paused for a moment to enjoy the look of shock on Lauren's face before continuing.
He didn't sell you out if that's what you're wondering. But don't think for a second it was a coincidence that he just so happened to assign the Oakside case to you, of all people. Like most humans, that man is very easily manipulated, and he led you right to our doorstep without even realizing it. Who do you think brought the case to his attention in the first place?
It was you. The demon. The collective. It was all you.
Lauren muttered, struggling to process these revelations.
But why? Why do all of that just to get to me? I'm nothing to you. I'm just some realtor.
No, Lauren, you're much more valuable than that. You are very important to somebody we've had our eyes on since before he was born.
Who?
Lauren said after a few moments of hesitation, terrified that she already knew the answer.
Noah Maxwell.
No! You leave him out of this!
Sorry to say it, but he's the entire reason we came after you.
What the hell is that supposed to mean?
You see, years ago during the Second World War, an artifact of great importance was claimed by Noah's grandfather, Karl Maxwell. The journal of Sebastian Krauss, a German soldier who was involved in an important event involving my keeper and our collective. Sebastian's journal was augmented by this event in a way that has proven most interesting to us, and so we desire to obtain it for ourselves. Unfortunately, we can't just take it from the old man because it has a certain aura about it, one that protects its owner from our wrath. Karl knows of its power and our goal. And because the journal's power is based on ownership, it can only be transferred willingly. Which is why we need Noah to get it from his grandfather and bring it to us. But he has proven particularly stubborn. That, Lauren, is where you come in. Noah still cares for you as much as you care for him, which is exactly why he hasn't contacted you for so many years. He didn't want you getting involved in our session, just like your other friends didn't want you getting involved in their own problems, but that decision was never theirs to make. It was ours. So, the good news is that the fire between you and Noah still burns, even after all those years apart. The bad news is that it's what we'll use to burn both of your worlds to the ground. With you as a bargaining chip, there's nothing he won't do for us. That's why we put so much effort into getting you here.
Lauren could hardly form words as the truth finally sank in. Everything she'd been through, all of the horrors her friends had been forced to live through, it had all been done to secure her as a bargaining chip, so that the enemy could steal a powerful artifact from her ex-boyfriend's family. Despite how absolutely insane it all sounded, she believed every word of it, but there was still one detail that didn't make sense to her.
So why go through all of the trouble to get to this point? Why not just take me years ago? Why torture my friends and use them as bait to lure me here? Why make us go through so much when you could have just killed everyone else and captured me whenever you wanted?
Where's the fun in that? The thing about us, Lauren, is that we aren't on a tight schedule. In our mission, there are innumerable candidates and innumerable sessions. We have nothing but time, so we can afford to have some fun with our playthings along the way. But now the time for fun is over. Now is the time for action! I'll tell you what, if you behave, then maybe we'll let you live to see how our plan plays out. Maybe you could even join our ranks. Imagine what you become with my keeper's blessing. But there's one big requirement.
The observer said sinisterly, putting his hand on Lauren's shoulder and leaning in close.
When the time comes, you will be the one to bring Noah to us. And together, we will end his session.
The observer's smile was abruptly wiped from his face when Lauren's fist smashed into it, making the malevolent entity stagger back, dropping down to his knees. In her fury, she was about to attack him again, But then something happened that she hadn't been expecting.
Lauren,
a raspy, strangled voice said, a voice that was entirely human. When the man before her looked back up to meet her eyes, she saw that his glasses had stopped glowing. His eyes seemed normal, and his face featured an expression of fear mixed with pain. To both her relief and horror, she knew in that moment that this wasn't the observer. This was Kevin.
Run,
he choked out. Suddenly, his eyes turned pitch black and ghostly shadows erupted from them, engulfing Kevin's body in its entirety as the observer took control of him once again. Lauren could only look on in horror as the shadowy wraith stood back up, his glasses once again burning with unholy white light. However, it wasn't a grin that appeared on his face, but a scowl.
You should really follow his advice,
the demon sneered, watching as the woman who'd struck him turned and ran off into the darkness, her eyes full of terror. His anger soon turned to amusement, and he found himself chuckling at the sight of her futile escape attempt. Eager to get on with the show,
"There has to be a way out of here,"
Lauren panted, running as fast as she could through the sea of ashes. The somber tune that droned on endlessly had become something much darker, something more threatening and sinister, as if the void itself was reacting to her actions. As she tried desperately to navigate the darkness, writhing black tentacles that were as tall as buildings and as thick as trees began to erupt from the ground all around her, spraying dirt, stones, and ash everywhere, as the clusters of glowing embers that littered the area turned into bloodshot eyes that watched her every move. It was taking everything she had to keep moving through the horrors surrounding her, and because of that, she almost ran right off the mountainside. She caught herself just in time, sliding to a stop at the edge of a rocky ledge, and knocking ashes and loose stones into the yawning chasm before her. She hadn't thought it was possible for this warped plane of existence to get any darker, but when she looked into the abyss, she knew that she'd been horribly wrong. Before she could turn away, she heard something coming from deep within the darkness below, something that made all other sounds momentarily fall silent. Something that sounded like whispering. As she peered into the depths, a massive eye suddenly appeared, staring back up from within the darkness.
I see you.
As the raspy, spine-chilling voice rang in Lauren's ears, an ice-cold wind billowed up from the abyss, chilling her to the bone. She covered her face with her arms and backed away from the formidable gale that was quickly surrounding her, threatening to lift her off the ground. Suddenly, she heard the sound of her boots hitting metal as the wind died out. She opened her eyes and looked around in awestruck terror, for she now stood on a small metal platform near the top of the radio tower, its dim red light barely visible a few feet above her head. Surrounding her was an ocean of darkness, leaving her with nowhere to run.
I want you to understand that when I tell you, we'll destroy all that you've built for yourself in this world. Everything you love, everything you know.
The observer suddenly hissed, materializing right behind her. When she spun around to face him, he grabbed her by the throat and lifted her into the air, locking eyes with her as he held her out over the edge of the platform.
That is not an empty threat.
Then, his grip loosened, and she heard his psychotic laughter mixing with her own screams as she plummeted into the abyss, barely able to see the metal beams of the radio tower flashing by. She hadn't been falling for long when she noticed the air becoming somewhat warm and muggy, and it was moments after that realization that the ground rushed up to meet her, and she smashed into something that felt like wooden planks, dimly aware that someone else had hit the ground at the same exact time, for she'd heard his cry of pain on impact. Lauren struggled to breathe as agony consumed every inch of her body. And despite her dazed, concussed stupor, she was somehow able to register that she wasn't dead, even though she definitely should have been. She wasn't sure how long she'd laid there before her senses started coming back to her, and when she finally opened her eyes, she saw a dark mangrove forest surrounding her and the boardwalk she was laying on. The same boardwalk she'd once gone for evening walks on with Noah.
Victor Park,
She thought, gazing up at what was no longer a radio antenna, but a wooden observation tower that stood tall on a platform that branched off from the rest of the boardwalk.
Why did they bring me here?
She wondered, feeling as if every bone in her body was broken. It was then that she noticed the sound of coughing, wheezing, and groaning coming from behind her, as if somebody else was struggling to breathe. The voice sounded familiar, and painfully, she managed to roll over and look at the man laying only a few feet away from her. A man who had flies buzzing around his head, and looked as if he'd just experienced a fall of his own. Even though his back was turned to her, Lauren recognized him instantly.
Noah?
She sputtered, unable to believe what she was seeing. Her call to him fell on deaf ears, and based on the noises he was making, he was in much worse of a condition than she was. It was as she was trying to reach for him that she saw the observer approaching them from further down the boardwalk, no longer wreathed in shadow, but still wearing those glowing white glasses and sporting a sinister smile.
Hey, man. Hey! Hey, man!
The observer said in Kevin's voice, shining a light on Noah and reaching down to pick something up off of the boardwalk. It was when he pointed at Noah that Lauren realized it was a camcorder.
Dude! Hey, man, we gotta get out of here!
It broke Lauren's heart to see Noah coughing up blood and groaning in pain, unable to form any other response.
You gotta get up, man. Dude, you gotta get up.
She could see Noah's hand move in front of his face, perhaps in an attempt to shield his eyes from the bright light that the observer was shining on him. She could only watch as the grinning possessor extended a hand to Noah, and to her horror, he reluctantly took it.
You don't look so good, dude. We gotta get out of here, man. Come on. You gotta get up, dude.
No.
Lauren whimpered, unable to do anything but watch helplessly as the observer helped Noah up onto his feet and began to lead the broken, confused man away from her, further down the boardwalk.
Come with me. I got you. Trust me, all right? I'm your friend.
The observer said, looking over his shoulder to grin at Lauren for a moment.
Let's get out of here. I'm just gonna bring you to the hospital.
Leave him alone!
Lauren cried out, but her call once again fell on deaf ears as Noah and the observer disappeared into the darkness, the former of whom had never even noticed her presence. Mustering all of the willpower she had left, she agonizingly began to crawl after them, feeling some of her strength returning to her. However, it wasn't long before her surroundings changed again. And when she felt her hand grasping at the cold cement, when she smelled the stale underground air and felt its chill, she knew where she was. The main chamber of the Coleman mine. Only this time, there was no lift waiting to set her free.
This can't be real. It can't be.
She whimpered, dragging herself over to a wall and managing to sit up and lean against it.
But it is, Lauren! It is! If you don't believe me, then why don't you just ask your friends? They wouldn't lie to you!
The observer's cruel voice rang out, once again warped and distorted into something inhuman. It was then that she saw two figures slowly approaching her, and as they stepped out of the darkness, her breath caught in her throat. The first figure was the chaser, who looked horribly thin and malnourished, as if she hadn't eaten anything in years. There was also the fact that her threadbare clothing was filthy and covered in dried blood that almost certainly wasn't her own. The second figure was the gruesome corpse of Carl Ross, stumbling towards her as if being burned to a crisp was only an inconvenience. Flakes of ash, soot, and scorched flesh fell from him with every movement, his charred body crunching and crackling sickeningly. Still slumped against the wall, Lauren looked on in horror as the remnants of her two best friends stopped moving mere inches away and looked down at her, a horrible smell emanating from both of them. The chaser then reached up with withered skeletal hands and removed her mask, revealing the mummified face of Kate Milens behind it. Her appearance was reminiscent of the decaying ghoul that Charlie Matheson Jr. had become, only Kate was significantly less mangled than the zombified boy. Her leathery skin was stretched tight across her bony face, which was missing its nose entirely. Her sunken eyes were milky white and glassy, her rotten teeth were clearly visible where her lips had peeled away, and most of her black hair had fallen out of her head. Lauren couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't act. She could only stare at the horrific sight in front of her in silent anguish.
You could have saved him if you tried harder.
Just like you could have saved us. You know that, don't you, Lauren?
They both said in unison, their warped voices sending pain shooting through her head.
I'm sorry.
She whimpered, tears welling up in her eyes.
I'm so sorry.
Suddenly, dozens of hands erupted from the concrete wall she was leaning against and seized her before she could do as much as scream. Some of them were bloody, some were rotten, some were skeletal, and some were burned. But all of them were dragging her into the wall like it was made of liquid. When she finally passed through the thick layers of concrete, she found herself unable to breathe, for she was at the bottom of Oakside Lake, the distant surface barely visible through the murky water. She mustered all of the strength she had left and began clawing her way towards the light far above. But the more Lauren struggled, the deeper she sank into her watery grave. Just as she felt like her lungs were about to burst, she heard the observer speaking to her once again.
Where were you when your friends needed you?
The scenery changed again, and when Lauren realized that she was no longer underwater, it took the drenched woman a few moments to stop gasping for air and realize that she was looking at an image of herself, sleeping soundly in the motel she'd stayed at the night she'd arrived in Oakside. As the storm raged outside, Lauren noticed the shadowy form of the observer standing at the foot of her bed, watching her past self sleep.
Oh, that's right. You were nice and cozy while the people you love got to suffer.
I was
Lazy.
The observer interrupted, turning to face her.
Arrogant. So full of yourself that you took the easy route, as per usual. You could have made that drive and you know it. Maybe if you actually tried, you would have been able to help Kate at least.
He scolded, watching with a smug expression as she started to believe what he was saying.
You disappoint us, Lauren. You disappoint all of us,
he said, shaking his head in disapproval. She felt her spirit breaking as a rushing sensation engulfed her, spinning her out at another new location. This time, she found herself standing in the middle of a dark forest. Perhaps it was somewhere in Oakside Park, but she had no way of telling.
Maybe if you weren't so pathetic, everyone you love wouldn't have to die,
the observer said in a somber tone. And as the shadows around her began to recede, she felt an overwhelming urge to vomit. Lauren had found herself surrounded by mutilated bodies impaled on jagged tree branches, not unlike the ones she'd read about while researching the dark history of Oakside. However, these weren't the bodies of the suited man's old victims. They were the mangled corpses of all of her loved ones. Her mom, her dad, her little sister Gwen, Lily, Aaron, and Noah. Even the people she didn't know all that well, like Russell and Cole, had been butchered and left to hang. And they'd all been slaughtered just to hurt her.
Their blood is on your hands, Lauren,
the observer said. It was then that Lauren finally broke down and let out a scream of anguish before slumping to the ground, her body trembling violently as she sobbed uncontrollably.
Stop it! Please stop! Please stop!
She begged, babbling incoherently as her entire world came crashing down around her. Everything she'd ever loved had been torn away from her in the blink of an eye, and even after all of that, it still wasn't over. Lauren heard a sharp snap and looked up to see Aaron's corpse fall to the ground. The now broken branch it was impaled on still sticking out of his torso. However, when his body hit the grass, it crawled up on its hands and knees and stared down at the dirt, taking deep, rattling breaths, as if it was barely alive. It was then that black blood started pouring from every inch of her friend's rapidly rotting body, as a gurgling, growling sound emanated from deep within his chest. All while Lauren was forced to watch powerlessly with tears streaming down her face. At first, she felt only anguish and disgust, but a whole new terror washed over her when his head suddenly snapped up to face her, and she saw that his face had peeled away to reveal a snarling, horribly deformed skull. The monster opened its mouth and let out a hellish roar, lunging at the woman it had once loved as a sister. Lauren screamed and scrambled backwards, but the ground gave way to the abyss once more. As she fell for the final time, she found herself begging for the nightmare to end, even if it meant her death. The second the thought crossed her mind, she collided with something sticky and found herself unable to move. It didn't take her long to figure out that she was lying on her back in a massive spiderweb that was suspended above the perpetual void. Nor did it take long for a set of massive, beady black eyes to appear high above her. Lauren was paralyzed with terror at the sight of the colossal black spider that towered over her, watching as its trembling prey struggled to escape from its all-consuming web. The beast stood there, motionlessly, studying her intently as if it was contemplating devouring her now or saving her for later. Then, to Lauren's surprise, she heard a voice come from it. A voice that was all too familiar.
I think that's quite enough.
She could only watch in confusion as reality melted around her, shifting and warping until she found herself sitting at the kitchen table in her warm, cozy apartment. Sitting in the chair at the opposite end of the table was the entity that the giant spider had morphed back into. The suited man, who looked calm, collected, and very pleased with himself.
I don't understand.
She stammered, utterly traumatized by the nightmarish torture that she'd just been subjected to.
On the contrary, you seem to understand quite well. You have seen what becomes of those who oppose me, and what I am capable of doing with their loved ones. Now that we understand one another, I will offer you a choice.
The demon said, his voice more threatening than she'd ever heard it before.
Work with me willingly, and this can all end. Cooperate, and your loved ones, they might just survive. That is the deal.
As she sat there, staring back at what she'd come to view as the very embodiment of evil, Lauren found herself at a complete loss for words. She was willing to do anything to protect those that she still had left, if the demon was indeed telling the truth about them being alive. But she didn't trust him for a second.
Hesitation will do you no favors, and I do believe I am being more than generous after what you did to me on the mountainside.
The suited man growled, standing up from his chair and approaching the terrified woman, who began to tremble in her seat as the monster loomed over her.
I will give you one last chance to submit, Lauren Jones. Now tell me.
It hissed, leaning in close.
Where are you?
What?
Lauren stammered, confused by the monster's question.
You'll never find out.
A familiar voice snarled, a voice that Lauren was relieved to hear. Before the suited man could react, a ball of fire exploded on his back, and as the demon shrieked and recoiled while its flesh bubbled and burned, the illusion of the apartment beginning to crumble around it, Lauren felt a gentle hand grip her shoulder.
Sorry for cutting it so close,
Firebrand said, and together they vanished from the monster's realm. She was still soaking wet and trembling when she found herself standing in the middle of a familiar road, one that she'd traveled countless times while growing up. For she'd been brought to the outskirts of her hometown, Crystal Falls, Michigan. At least, it bore resemblance to the place she'd spent her childhood in, the place where she'd formed an unbreakable bond with Kate and Carl. But there was something about it that made it seem both familiar and foreign at the same time. Something unnatural. It was the middle of the night and everything was wet with dew, but the sky was starless and carried a deep purple tint. Lauren was thankful for the dim light coming from the full moon, as she wouldn't have been able to see anything without it, for none of the street lamps were active. They were cold and dead, as if the decrepit lights had never worked to begin with. The air in this place was far more breathable than that of the void she'd just been saved from. But it carried the faint scent of rotting mulch and was permeated by an ominous buzzing sound that droned on endlessly. Crickets and katydids called to each other without rest, and the longer she gazed at the eerie shadows being cast by the moonlight, the more intimidating they became.
This isn't Crystal Falls,
Lauren whispered, unsure of what to make of her new surroundings.
I thought you'd appreciate something that looked familiar. Especially after that.
A familiar voice said from behind her. A voice that no longer carried any unearthly distortion. Firebrand's voice.
I don't know what your game is, but you'd better start explaining yourself, right?
Lauren began, but froze on the spot when she turned around and finally got a good look at the mysterious entity. For much like the observer had revealed his true self to her, Firebrand was allowing his shadows to recede as well, finally revealing the man beneath them. He was Korean American, slightly taller than she was, and a warm smile was present on his face. But he looked a few years older than he should have, and his skin was covered in burn scars. His jet black hair had grown out so long that it nearly covered his ears, and his facial hair was rather unkempt as well. He wore a hoodless sweatshirt, old jeans, and faded shoes, all of which were black. And as Lauren stood there staring at him in horror, she understood why his voice had sounded so familiar to her this entire time. She watched as the last of the shadows receded into his eyes that were completely black save for their pupils, which glowed white with unholy power. Soon enough, his eyes took on a normal appearance, leaving the only evidence of his true nature, the burns on his face and the pale, almost ghostly complexion of his skin. Lauren wanted to cry when she looked at Firebrand, for standing in front of her, now transformed into a creature of shadow, was the man she'd fallen in love with.
Noah?
She choked out, unable to believe what she was seeing.
There was a time when I went by that name. Yes, but that was long ago. And the life I once lived is but a distant memory now.
As he spoke to her, he began approaching the traumatized woman, and when she saw him drawing near, she could only think of the horrors she'd gone through mere moments ago.
Stop!
She shouted, and Firebrand did, holding up his hands as if to say that he wasn't going to hurt her. Hands that were marked with thin scars that looked more like eyelids than wounds.
I don't know what your deal is, but I just saw Noah a few minutes ago and he wasn't some shadow demon. What the hell are you, and why do you look like him?
Listen, I know how terrified you must be right now, and what I'm about to say will probably confuse you even more than you already are. But it's the truth. I promise you that.
Firebrand said in a gentle voice, lowering his hands.
The Noah Maxwell you know is fine, more or less. I come from an alternate future. One where I was assimilated into the collective and forced to do the administrator's bidding. With the help of another, I broke free from my chains and started taking the fight to the enemy. Eventually, that fight turned sour, and I had no choice but to use my new abilities to go back in time and try again. Now, I've dedicated my very existence to destroying our foes and saving my past self from suffering the same fate I did. As for you, well, aside from sentimental reasons, I couldn't let them use you to get to Noah. If the enemy gets a hold of Sebastian's journal, all will be lost.
For a few moments, Lauren could only stand there and look at him in bewilderment. As insane as it all sounded at first, the things she'd witnessed had made Firebrand's words seem plausible.
If all of that is true, and you're really a future version of Noah,
Lauren said, taking a deep breath as she fought to stay calm,
then you're gonna have to prove to me that this isn't just another trick. Tell me something that only Noah would know.
I'm not sure that I can. The enemy knows almost everything about us, including our memories. Granted, they can't read my mind anymore.
Then do something to prove you aren't one of them! Anything!
Lauren shouted. After a moment of hesitation, Firebrand raised his hand and snapped his fingers, and immediately a circle of fire surrounded them both. She instantly knew that this was the same fire that had caused the inferno at the radio station, for she could feel its otherworldly intensity. But in such a small quantity, it seemed tame, as if Firebrand had it under control.
You started that forest fire. Why?
She asked, trying not to sound scared.
They would have taken you then if I hadn't intervened.
He answered, extinguishing the flames with a wave of his hand and beginning to approach her.
Disrupting the enemy's plans takes a lot of effort, and in this case, it took a lot of destruction. I'm sure you've already figured this out, but what I'm capable of summoning is no ordinary flame. It's a powerful, extremely dangerous force called hellfire. They say that it burns your very soul, and learning how to wield it is how I got these,
he said, pointing at his scars.
Normally, wounds caused by hellfire would never heal.
Firebrand began, taking Lauren's burned hands in his own.
But time manipulation is kind of my specialty. Something like this is simple enough to undo, even if it is a bit tiring.
As the eyes on his palms opened and began to glow, Lauren could only watch in awe as her wounds slowly vanished and the pain that came with them disappeared entirely. It wasn't only her hands that were healed either, for she could feel all of the damage that she'd sustained at the hands of the Observer being mended as well. By the time Firebrand removed his hands from hers, and the eyes on his palms closed once more, she wasn't even wet from her near drowning in the lake anymore.
See? You can trust me.
For a moment, Lauren was at a loss for words, and then an avalanche of emotions washed over her as all of the trauma, pain, and sorrow finally surged forward, and she threw her arms around Firebrand's neck and balled into his shoulder, unable to keep her composure any longer.
There you go. Just let it all out,
he told her, putting a comforting arm around her.
I'm so sorry, Lauren. I never meant for them to get to you.
I'm sorry I didn't trust you.
It's okay. I would have reacted the same way. You don't typically experience this kind of shit outside of the mental ward.
Firebrand joked, earning a muffled laugh from Lauren. Eventually, she pulled away from him and wiped the tears from her puffy red eyes.
Thank you, she
said, managing a weak smile.
So, you're a revolutionary, and you managed to burn yourself. Kind of gives a double meaning to the name Firebrand.
She joked, and they both laughed as the tension between them finally dissipated.
It's good to see you, Lauren,
Firebrand said with a smile.
It's good to see you too, even if you aren't exactly Noah anymore,
she said. It was then that she remembered what she'd seen happening on the boardwalk.
Oh my god, Noah! He's still in that nightmare! Firebrand, please, you have to do something! He'll die if you don't help him!
Easy, Lauren. Noah escaped from their realm over 2 years ago,
Firebrand said. Noticing the look of confusion on her face, he decided to elaborate.
Back in 2015, I brought him to the boardwalk to teach him a valuable lesson. The collective tried to use my meddling to their advantage, but I knew they would fail because I've already lived through those events. He escaped their realm a wiser man, and a more resilient one too. If I hadn't forced his hand, he never would have made any progress in our mission.
So, what I saw was just a memory of what happened back then? Like, how they showed me what happened to Charlie?
Not quite. The collective's realm exists beyond the boundaries of time and space, constantly warping and shifting to serve their needs. The place can be whatever they want it to be, do whatever they want it to do, and it answers only to them and the big man himself. That's why the Observer had so much control over the place but has limited power in your world. It's his domain. I suppose you could say the place is a pocket between your dimension and something else. Sort of a dark tunnel between realities. That's why we call it the crawl space.
Firebrand explained, pausing for a moment so Lauren could keep up with what he was saying.
Time works differently there. Minutes are hours. Hours are days. Days are weeks. Weeks are months. Months are years, and so on. But because it isn't bound by mortal logic, the flow of time can move in any way, including backward, which is what happened when you wound up on that boardwalk. Essentially, Noah's past became your present while also remaining the past. It's confusing, I know, but like I said, their realm isn't meant for mortals. You're lucky you made it out with your sanity intact.
Okay, that's really confusing, but I think I understand.
Lauren said, trying to wrap her head around what she was hearing. She thought about asking how Noah had survived that fall, or how she herself had done the same, but didn't see much of a point in it considering she was surrounded by things that made no sense.
So there's no reason to save Noah because he already made it out, but what about Kevin? What about...
She stopped talking as the horrific memory of all of her loved ones, dead or worse, entered her mind.
None of that was real, Lauren. Everything you went through in there, with the exception of Noah and the boardwalk, was only an illusion. It was meant to break you down completely and force you into submission. They haven't hurt anybody you care about other than Kate and Carl. And with you being MIA now, they won't have any reason to target them. There's no point if you aren't around to watch them suffer. As for Kevin,
Firebrand said, a scowl appearing on his face.
That's a different story. The Observer has been possessing him for so long that there isn't much left of our old friend anymore. Just bits and pieces of humanity that show themselves every now and then. It's far too late for him. The only way to save Kevin would be to put him out of his misery. And believe me, killing the Observer is something I think about every day.
As relieved as she was to hear her loved ones hadn't been harmed, the horrific, gruesome sights that she'd been shown were something that would haunt her until the day she died. Furthermore, Lauren wasn't convinced that Kevin was beyond saving, but she decided not to argue with the man who'd just saved her from an interdimensional torture chamber. That, and there was something else that was bothering her.
What the demon said about me working for him willingly. How it would save the people I care about. Was he telling the truth?
Do you need to ask? You know what they say about making deals with the devil, Lauren. Even if he keeps his word, there's always a catch.
Are you telling me that's what he really is? The devil?
No. He's worse.
Firebrand said gravely. As much as she hated the suited man, as much as she distrusted him, Lauren couldn't deny that a part of her had been tempted to take his deal if it meant her loved ones would be safe. Even now, she found herself contemplating his offer. And for that reason, she decided to change the subject.
You said the crawl space is a pocket between dimensions. If one of them is ours, then what's the other one?
It's best that we don't talk about that just yet.
Okay, next question. How did I end up in there? The last thing I remember is Charlie attacking me, and then I was just there. Did he take me to that place? He was using those weird symbols like they were portals in Carl's tape. Do you think he did it again?
No. Charlie doesn't know how to open gates to their world. Back on the farm, he was utilizing a rift that existed long before he took up residence there. He told me himself when I freed him from the administrator's grasp.
You freed him? How? When?
It was some time ago, not long after Kate moved to Oakside. I needed a pair of eyes to keep an eye on the situation, and Charlie was the perfect candidate. When his mind was his own again, I explained my mission and promised to restore his humanity if he worked with me to keep you safe from the enemy. You saw how I manipulated time to heal your wounds, so imagine what I could do for him.
Firebrand explained, much to Lauren's amazement.
Of course, I couldn't completely sever him from the administrator just yet. His current form is far too unstable for that, and we needed the big man to think he was still under his control, so the mental link between them is still there to some extent. I promised Charlie that I'd finish the job once the mission was complete, and ever since that day, he's been working for me as an undercover operative. I've had him following you the entire time you've been in Oakside, keeping an eye on you when I couldn't. I'm sure you've heard him sneaking around a few times.
Wait, so all those times I heard leaves crunching in the woods or felt like something was watching me, that was Charlie?
That's right. The administrator and his collective knew the path you would take, so they didn't need to keep an eye on you all that much, which allowed Charlie to go unnoticed by our enemies. The only mistake he made was when he met you in that burned house and lashed out when you wouldn't put him out of his misery. But can you really blame him for that? The kid's been through so much, it makes sense that he'd go for the release of death when the opportunity presented itself.
But if he's on our side, then why?
Did he attack you in the radio station? He didn't. We knew you would never go anywhere with him willingly, so after he saved you from Kate, he put you to sleep for a little while to make transportation easier. Then I placed a protective ward around him so those monsters wouldn't be able to track your location while he took you to a safer place. That's why the administrator was asking you where you were. The enemy has no idea where we've taken you, and they're doing everything they can to find out. I would have gotten you out of there myself, but I had to put out the fire before it got out of control and destroyed all of Oakside. So I had Charlie do it instead.
Firebrand watched in amusement as Lauren processed this information, chuckling at the look on her face when the truth of her situation finally dawned on her.
That's right, Lauren. This is all happening in your head, but don't mistake it for a simple dream. Everything you've been through has actually happened to you, just mentally instead of physically. The best way I can explain it is that our enemies summoned your consciousness to the crawl space as a last-ditch effort to track you down when they couldn't find your physical body. But then I saved you, and now we're here. Physically, you're in a safe place with Charlie, but mentally, you're here with me.
This just gets more confusing by the minute.
Lauren said, rubbing her temples.
Speaking of Kate, Charlie didn't kill her, did he?
No. He only knocked her out. Your friend is still alive, if you can call that being alive.
Right. That demon has complete control over her, doesn't he?
Lauren muttered in despair.
For now, yes. Believe it or not, that's actually a good thing if we're going to remedy your condition.
How is that a good thing? And what do you mean by remedy? Are you saying that you could fix what he did to her? Is there a chance that she'll be okay?
Lauren said, feeling her hopes beginning to rise for the first time since she discovered the Chaser's identity.
Yes. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Firebrand confirmed, a hint of a smile appearing on his face.
And it's a good thing because normally the administrator drives his victims to insanity before either killing them or taking full control of their mind, body, and soul. However, sometimes he'll lock them inside of their own heads and force them to watch their bodies carry out his bidding. And that's exactly what he did to Kate. He usually saves that method for when he's feeling particularly sadistic, but in this case, it was done because of how quickly he needed her subservient with you on your way into the fray. Fortunately for her, breaking someone out of a mental prison is much easier than healing a broken psyche, and that's exactly what we're going to do when the time comes.
Wow, that's amazing, Firebrand! You'll really help her?
Lauren said with an elated smile on her face.
Of course. But I'm afraid we have more pressing matters to attend to at the moment. I don't mean to force you into action so soon after what you went through, but we have much to discuss and very little time.
With those words, he turned and started walking down the street, beckoning her to follow.
Come on. We can talk more while we head to the rendezvous point. There's someone you need to meet before you wake up.
Who would that be?
Lauren asked, following close behind.
Someone who should be spoken to with the utmost caution, especially in the case of a mortal such as yourself. He is an ally in this fight, for we have mutual interests, but he's still a very dangerous individual. He might seem friendly when you meet him, but make no mistake, his mood can change in an instant.
Do you trust him?
Lauren asked, suddenly growing nervous.
I trust that he wants the administrator to suffer just as much as we do. Like I said, we have mutual interests, but he can be unpredictable. As long as I'm around, you'll be safe. But do me a favor and try not to piss him off.
Understood,
Lauren said, and they walked in silence for a few minutes, approaching the parking lot of a dark building further down the street. As they got closer, she realized that it was a roadside diner, but it wasn't one that she recognized. In fact, the last time she'd been to Crystal Falls, there hadn't even been a building in that spot. But she'd been away from home for so long that she wasn't sure if it was an actual place on Earth, or if the realm she'd been brought to had simply created it on its own.
This ally, he's waiting for us in there?
She asked. Firebrand only nodded in response, an uneasy look on his face. As another silence fell over them, Lauren began to mull over everything she'd learned since she'd been transported to the Collective's realm, and it was then that she remembered something from the very beginning of her waking nightmare.
Hey, Firebrand, there's something I've been wondering. Before I ever came to Oakside, someone left a note in my apartment telling me that I wouldn't live to regret coming here if I went through with it. Was that just you trying to scare me off?
Firebrand suddenly turned his head and gave her a look of intrigue.
No, it wasn't,
he said, much to Lauren's confusion.
I never attempted to contact or interact with you before that night in Oakside Park. Unless you count having Charlie follow you around.
Then who put that note in my apartment? Do you think it could have been the Observer?
I don't know, Lauren, but I don't think the enemy had anything to do with it. They wanted you to come to Oakside, not stay away.
No offense, but how do you not know this kind of stuff? Isn't knowing the past kind of your specialty with all of the time travel stuff?
Well, the thing is, this isn't the first time I've had to turn back the clock. I've lost count of how many times I've had to reset the timeline rather than let our enemies win.
Firebrand said, much to Lauren's shock.
Every time I do, there's minor alterations in what happens. Fluctuations in the timeline that deviate from my past attempts at winning this game of theirs. Some can be quite significant, but most of them are small things like a tree falling that didn't before or the stock market taking an unexpected dip. I'm almost positive that the note in your apartment is one of those fluctuations. As for who left it there and why, I have no idea. Perhaps someone could look into it after we get your situation under control.
Wait, so you're not just traveling back in time then? You're actually rewinding everything that's ever happened?
Lauren stammered, unsure of how she felt about this revelation. The idea that she and the rest of the world had lived countless lives due to Firebrand's mission, all of which had been completely erased and replaced with a reset timeline each time his planet failed, was absolutely terrifying, even if he was doing it for the right reasons. Even more terrifying was the fact that she had no memory of any of it, and would never have even considered something like that if Firebrand hadn't outright said it. She didn't even want to think about how many deaths she and her loved ones must have experienced over the course of those countless alternate timelines. And so, she pushed that idea right out of her head. As inclined as she was to not believe a word he was saying, he'd already proven to her how trustworthy he was. And because of that, she had no choice but to simply accept what he said as the truth and move forward with the conversation if she wanted more answers.
How the hell are you able to do any of that? I get that you're some kind of supernatural demigod now, but that seems a bit much even by your standards.
None of it would be possible if not for this,
Firebrand said, pulling a large brown leather-bound journal out of thin air as they made their way across the diner's parking lot. Even from a distance, Lauren could feel the raw power radiating from it.
Is that
Sebastian's journal? Yes, it is,
Firebrand said, stopping just before the door of the diner and holding it up for her to see.
Because of this journal, I've obtained the ability to manipulate reality itself. Because of this, I was able to break away from my place in the timeline when I turned back the clock for the first time and every time after that. It has allowed me to exist as my own entity apart from Noah Maxwell. And because of that, I'm able to continue our fight against the Administrator beyond the limitations of time and space.
They stood there in silence for a few moments, for once again, Lauren had found herself at a loss for words. Firebrand then lowered the journal and let it vanish into thin air, grabbing a hold of the diner's door handle.
I'll explain more once we're inside. Let's try to get this introduction out of the way as smoothly as we can.
Then, he pushed the doors open, and they both stepped into the dark restaurant. The first thing she noticed was the lit candles scattered around the room, serving as the only source of light in the otherwise normal-looking diner. And the second was the fact that a Frank Sinatra song was playing over the restaurant's speakers. Finally, she noticed a bored-looking man sitting in a booth close to the door. A thin red and white cardboard box sitting on the table in front of him.
Firebrand?
Habit,
Firebrand responded, motioning for Lauren to come forward.
This is...
Lauren, right?
Habit said, immediately perking up.
Come on in. Fine dining here. This place is the best pizza around. Speaking of which, you hungry?
As Lauren and Firebrand sat down on the opposite side of the booth, Habit spun the box around and opened it, revealing a large meat lover's pizza inside.
Oh, thanks.
Lauren began, taken aback by the strange man's antics.
But I don't have much of an appetite after what just happened.
In actuality, Lauren was starving, but she wasn't about to accept anything that Habit offered her after what Firebrand had told her about him.
Suit yourself. That just means there's more for me.
Habit said with a smirk, picking up a slice and beginning to eat, not even bothering to offer Firebrand a piece. As Lauren's eyes adjusted to the candlelight and she got a good look at him, she was unsure of what to think about her new ally. Habit looked like a normal person, but he had dark circles under his eyes, and his skin was rather pale. He wore a dark Hawaiian shirt under a ripped-up, dark gray, hooded flannel jacket that was rather faded, along with torn blue jeans and an old pair of brown work boots. His dark hair was short and choppy, but most of it was covered by a black baseball cap that featured a red stripe along its rightmost side. He also had an average build and was roughly as tall as Lauren, but what made her uneasy around him, aside from his strange demeanor, went beyond the fact that his jacket was noticeably stained with dried blood. If she listened closely when he spoke, she could hear a second voice accompanying his normal one. A voice that was deep and sinister, but barely audible, like a whisper. As if that wasn't unnerving enough, there was also the fact that when she looked into his mischievous eyes, she saw that his irises glowed an unearthly shade of purple. Their glow was barely noticeable, as was the second voice, but these details were enough to let her know that this habit wasn't entirely human, and she got the sense that he could be just as dangerous as the suited man if he truly wanted to, and was perhaps just as powerful.
But if you change your mind and decide you want something to eat or drink, feel free to ask. The bartender will be happy to accommodate,
he said, gesturing towards the bar on the other end of the room. When Lauren looked over to see what he was pointing out, she jumped in her seat, for standing behind the bar and wiping down glasses was a pale, lanky humanoid creature that was completely featureless aside from a giant eye that took up most of its face.
Don't worry, Jerry's harmless,
Habit chuckled, having noticed her reaction to the strange being.
In fact, he's the best cook I know. Ain't that right, Jerry?
Jerry gave a thumbs up and finished cleaning the glass, moving over to a stove and beginning to cook something.
This place has power?
Lauren muttered, still bewildered by the enigmatic chef.
Damn right it does! I'd lose my mind here if it didn't. Just imagine having to cross dimensions every time you want some hot food or internet access. Talk about a pain in the ass.
Then why are you using candles instead of electricity?
Well, the thing about this realm is that it's a chunk of reality that I kind of stole from our friend in the suit. You'd better believe the big stick in the mud was pissed when I took over a piece of his precious crawl space. Not that he can do shit about it, the bureaucratic fuck. Serves him right for letting our arrangement fall through like that.
Arrangement?
It's not important. What I'm getting at here is that, because this place used to be connected to the crawl space, it still has a tendency to consume excess light, no matter how much I modify it to suit my own needs. So electronic lights are pretty much useless. Fire, on the other hand, does a much better job of breaking through the darkness, which is why we use candles. And I mean just regular old fire, not the fancy shit that Brandy here likes to conjure,
he explained, glancing at Firebrand.
It would do a much better job of lighting this place up.
Yeah, by burning down the whole goddamn restaurant. I get that you don't need to eat. But let the rest of us enjoy things, why don't you?
As Lauren listened to their banter, she had to admit that she found it amusing. This was not how she would have expected two demigods to behave.
Anyway, because of our lighting situation, some of you are kind of taken to calling this place the Candleverse. I've always thought it was a corny name myself, but to each their own.
My kind? So you really aren't human?
My vessel is.
So you're a possessor? Well, what are you, then? A spirit? Or demon? Or something?
It wasn't lost on her that Habit was possessing an unwilling host, but she wasn't exactly eager to start an argument with him about it. It did explain why she could hear two voices when she listened close enough, though.
I prefer the term mortally challenged,
Habit said with a smirk.
Right. And you said that other humans have been in this place before?
I have had my fair share of visitors. Most of them weren't too happy to be here, and rightfully so. We had a lot of fun together. Oh, don't worry though. Any friend of Firebrand is a friend of mine. I'm not gonna hurt you.
Thanks,
Lauren said, glancing at Firebrand. who gave her a look that told her to just go with it.
You're fucking welcome!
Habit said gleefully. They sat in silence for a few moments as Habit rolled up another slice of pizza and bit into it. And it was then that Lauren noticed another person sitting at the back of the restaurant. A middle-aged man wearing circular glasses, a dark brown suede jacket, and dark khaki pants. A laptop and several books sat on the table in front of him, and he appeared to be working on something while eating steak and french fries off of a dinner plate.
Who is that?
That's Skinny Ari. Don't mind him, he's my archivist.
Firebrand answered. At the sound of his name, Skinny Ari looked up from his laptop and glanced over at Lauren, studying her for a moment before returning to his work.
Now that introductions are out of the way, I suppose we should get down to business. I'm sure you're wondering why we brought you here instead of just sending you back to Earth. And that's because now is the only chance we'll have to explain things to you before we start getting really busy. And after what you've been through, I figured an explanation was the least we could do for you.
That's the same reason he left those tapes for you to find. He felt like you deserved to know the truth, and that you needed a little break from all the chaos.
That, and the tapes contain vital knowledge that's already making this whole explanation process easier on you.
Well, I appreciate it,
Lauren said, not really sure what to say about the matter beyond that.
Since we were already on the topic, why don't you elaborate more on that journal of yours? I get that it's powerful, but you didn't really explain why, or what the enemy wants with it.
As you wish. It all began with my grandfather on my mother's side of the family, Carl Maxwell. When he was in his 20s, he served as a soldier in World War II. He was German-born, but fought for the Allies and eventually joined the OSS. Because he grew up near the Black Forest and was familiar with the geography, they sent him and a few others on an espionage mission in the area.
The Black Forest. That's the place Frida's storybook mentioned. The one Carl found in his tape.
Indeed it was. The administrator was rather fond of that forest back then, which is where all of those myths about Der Grossmann came from. When the war broke out, those stories attracted some unwanted guests.
The Nazis?
That's right. The Nazis were very interested in old legends and mythology, and Der Grossmann of the Black Forest was no exception. Deep in the forest, they had this secret operation called Project Jotun that was dedicated to capturing the administrator and turning him into a weapon. That, and they wanted to harness his power for their own use, too.
I'm guessing that didn't work out so well for them. Can't say the bastards didn't deserve what they got.
Lauren commented, earning a chuckle from habit. Firebrand nodded his head in agreement and continued speaking.
Now, the Nazis were far from the first group of people to take an interest in the administrator. And they weren't the last either. Case in point, years after the war, the remnants of an old organization called Novus Ordo Europa came together to form the Order. A secret society that worships the demon like it's a god. But that's a whole other topic. What set the Nazis apart from so many other factions is that they had a way of getting what they wanted. And sure enough, they managed to lure the administrator into a trap. What they didn't realize is that he was just toying with them, letting them perform their little experiments while he slowly tore them apart from the inside. And when shit finally hit the fan, it resulted in a multi-dimensional, reality-shattering event that disrupted the very fabric of time and space. It didn't last long, but it was something the likes of which the world has never seen before. The true nature of the event, as well as a few other factors, are the reason it was never recorded by historians and was eventually lost to time. What happened that day was far beyond mortal comprehension, so perhaps it's best that it remains hidden from humanity.
And that is where the journal comes in.
Habit interjected, biting into another slice of pizza.
Correct. The journal originally belonged to a Nazi soldier by the name of Sebastian Krauss, who was assigned to Project Jotun. Sebastian recorded every detail of the project that he possibly could, as well as personal experiences throughout it. But that isn't what makes it special. When the event happened, Sebastian and his journal were present for it. As a result of direct contact with the anomaly that occurred that night, the journal became imbued with unimaginable power, as well as forbidden knowledge that could prove very detrimental to the administrator and the collective. By simply owning the journal, one has the capability of utilizing its power and its knowledge. That is why they want it so badly. That is why they're going through so much trouble to get it, including what they did to you and your friends. Not simply because they're interested in it, but because it can be used as a weapon against them.
But if you already have it, then why are they going after my Noah instead of you?
Because mine isn't the only copy of Sebastian's journal,
Firebrand said, with a grim look on his face.
When I turned back time, everything that happened was reset, including Carl giving me the journal. However, since I exist outside of the timeline's logic and limitations, so does my version of the journal now that I'm actively utilizing its power. Therefore, there now exists 2 journals, the one I have and the one that Carl owns. The enemy realized a long time ago that it would be futile to try to get mine from me, so they've been targeting the other version of it instead. Since the journal protects its owner from their wrath, and ownership of it can only be transferred to another person willingly, they can't just take it because Carl would never hand it over to them. He's far too terrified of its true power to use it like I do, but he's done a damn good job of protecting it. I only wish he would have given the thing to me sooner than he did, but he didn't want to place that burden on his family, so he can be forgiven. That's the whole reason he became a reclusive hermit in the first place.
Speaking of which, how did he ever get a hold of that thing if ownership of it has to be transferred willingly?
Good question. By the time the event was over with, almost everyone involved with it was dead or worse. The journal protected Sebastian from the worst of it, and he fled into the forest with the administrator close behind. He ended up stumbling across my grandfather and his squad while they were camped out for their mission. And on the brink of madness, Sebastian made a choice. He knew that he wasn't in any shape to fight the administrator, and would have given the journal to it when it inevitably caught up with him. So he gave it to Carl and told him to protect it with his life. Sebastian knew less than a fraction of what his tome was capable of, but it was enough to convince him to abandon his loyalties and transfer ownership of it to an enemy soldier, especially after what he saw the monster do. After that, the administrator showed up and attacked him. Carl and his squad opened fire on it and tried to save him, but as you've learned firsthand, bullets don't hurt him. He dragged Sebastian off into the night, and that was the last they ever saw of him. By the time the administrator learned what had happened, Carl and his squad were already gone. After the war, he immigrated to America with his wife and they had kids a little while later. That's why they've been after my family since the 40s. That's why they've been going after Noah and you, because they know they can use the 2 of you to get their hands on it. If they get a hold of that journal, not only would they eliminate our best shot at defeating them, but they would be able to use its power to even the playing field and stop what I've been doing. I will not allow that to happen, even if it means failing 1,000 more times until the mission is complete.
Well said, friend.
Habit said with a mouthful of food, already halfway through the pizza.
Okay, I think I follow you. As batshit insane as this all sounds. What I don't understand is why Carl thought it would be a good idea to start a family when those things were already after him. Didn't he ever stop to consider that they might hurt his wife and children to get to him?
Well, Carl didn't understand just how important the journal was until the administrator showed up in his life again a few years after the war. And by then, he and my grandma already had 2 daughters. My mother, Sharon, and her sister, Mary.
You mean Mary as in Mary Asher, right? Milo's mother?
Lauren asked. Mary was the aunt whose funeral she'd attended all those years ago. The mother who'd lost her son, Milo, to an apparent suicide, which had been the catalyst for Noah's downward spiral. She'd never known Mary personally, but she'd met Milo a few times when he'd stopped by to visit Noah.
Yeah, her. Although I'm sure you already know her by another name. Cursor.
Firebrand watched Lauren's expression turn confused, and it took him a moment to understand why.
Sorry, I've been dealing with the collective for so long that I tend to forget that others aren't as familiar with them as I am. Cursor is the woman with the stitched eyes and that creepy-ass smile.
Mary is that lady? She's one of them?
Lauren stammered. Mary's funeral had been closed casket, and she'd never seen her in person before, only pictures. And that was part of the reason she hadn't recognized her when the collective had revealed themselves to her in Oakside Park. Looking back on it, she could see the resemblance if she looked past how warped and disturbing her appearance had become.
Is she being possessed like Kevin is?
Sort of. Mary was killed a long time ago, as you already know since you went to her funeral. Cursor is just inhabiting a dead vessel.
Don't even think about feeling bad for her. That bitch got what she deserved and then some.
Personally, I think she got off easy.
Firebrand commented, noticing the look of shock on Lauren's face when he said that.
Mary Asher was a terrible woman, Lauren. She didn't start out that way, but she became something truly despicable before the end.
Care to elaborate?
When the administrator finally found Carl and his family, he realized that he couldn't do anything to Carl because of the journal's protective ward around him. So he started targeting Mary instead. Why he picked her alone and not my mother or grandmother is something I still don't understand, but Mary started seeing the administrator at a young age, and for years she was tormented by the creature because it wanted her to get the journal from Carl. She tried and failed a few times, and eventually she moved out, got married, and had a kid, Milo. The thing is, Mary grew up to be a selfish bitch who was only worried about self-preservation. She did a lot of terrible things before she finally died, and the only reason she had Milo was so she could sacrifice him to the administrator to save herself.
That's horrible.
You don't know the half of it. Milo's life was a living hell because of her, and I never knew it until long after it was too late to help. Even if Mary had been a good mother, he still would have had a shitty life because the enemy stalked him for most of it. And it was for the same reason they went after Mary.
And so he killed himself because of it.
Not quite. Milo did what he did because he found out what Mary was up to. What his whole life was meant for. He took himself out so Mary wouldn't be able to use him to save herself. Not that it would have worked out in her favor anyway. The enemy was after both of them. And when Milo died, they brought him back as a member of the collective. But not before torturing him until he was barely recognizable. They aren't fond of people who take the easy way out when it comes to this little game of theirs. Especially when they're high-priority targets.
So, Milo's the one with all of those awful wounds on him?
Yep. Mr. Scars, as he calls himself. Living as one of them is a terrible existence. But if there's one silver lining to what happened to Milo, it's that he had the last laugh in the end. A few years later, after the collective had been coming after me for some time, they decided that it was time to finally kill Mary and turn her into one of them. And they sent Mr. Scars to do it. It's a fucked up form of retribution, but Mary got what was coming to her.
Look, I get that this is all important, but what does this have to do with my situation? Why are you telling me all of this?
Lauren asked, more than confused by her unexpected history lesson.
Because you need to know your enemy. You won't stand a chance against them if you don't even understand what they are. Their identities aren't just mindless trivia, and neither is what happened that turned them into monsters. You need to understand how they operate, which is what my lightly broiled friend here was just getting to.
That's right. Now, Lauren, you've seen our enemy's minions before. You know what he did to Kate, what he turned Charlie into. But to him, they're nothing more than two more tools on his workbench. A couple of mindless slaves without a purpose until he needs something from them. He has servants like those all over the world, and there's a few notable ones who actually serve him willingly. But the collective is different. They're a hive mind of powerful entities created by the administrator for one purpose, and that is to retrieve Sebastian's journal. They're parasitic in nature, requiring a mortal host to survive outside of their realm, and it doesn't have to be a living one either.
But they do prefer live vessels. I can sympathize. Possessing dead people just isn't the same. I'm sure you've noticed how robotic and lifeless most of the collective seemed, and that's because almost all of them are stuck piloting corpses. A living host catalyzes their power, makes them much stronger than they would be with a dead one. That's why the Observer took over Kevin while he was still alive. He's the big guy's right-hand man, so he has the privilege of possessing a living host to become more powerful than his colleagues. It's more convenient that way. Less opportunity for the others to rebel with the Observer keeping them in line. Not that they'd have the guts to.
In any case, they have to possess a human body to interact with the mortal world. And the ones they inhabit are exclusively those with a connection to Sebastian's journal, like Mary and Milo. The same goes for those that they haunt. But on rare occasions, they'll go after a person who's important to their target to use them to their advantage, like you and Kevin. That's because the entire purpose of their existence is to get that book. So everything they do is tied to it in some way. They'll stop at nothing to get their hands on it.
So there's nothing left of Milo and Mary then? Mr. Scars and Cursor are just parasites controlling their dead bodies?
Well, a few fragments of who they used to be still exist within them, but for the most part, yes. It's the same deal with Swain, the one with the theater mask. and Deadhead, the creepy fucker with the exposed skull. Those two are the only members of the collective who aren't directly related to my family. Even the Observer is more involved with us than them. And that's because Kevin was my best friend, so they used him to get to me.
So what do Swain and Deadhead have to do with anything?
They were involved with the event. I guess you could say those two were the founding members of the collective. And before you ask how I know that, yes, I was involved with it too. It was part of my arrangement with the big guy before we had our falling out.
Wait, so Swain and Deadhead were both Nazis? Like, actual Nazis? And not the people we have now who live in their parents' basements and think they're Nazis?
Yep.
And you're telling me that you were involved with the event too, so that means you worked with those assholes?
Hey, I never claimed to be a good person.
Habit said, putting his arms behind his head and leaning back in his seat, smirking at the scowl on her face.
The Nazis are far from the first group of nasties I've worked with over the years, and they certainly weren't the last. Rest assured, I worked with them to suit my own needs, not theirs. But truthfully, I've done things that would put Schittler and his stupid-ass mustache to shame. I really don't care about doing the right thing or fighting for the greater good. It just so happens that old Stick in the Mud pissed me off one time too many. So now I want him dead. You know what they say, Lauren. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
She would have told him to go to hell right then and there, if not for the look that Firebrand was giving her. A look that told her to remember what he said, and not anger this loathsome entity that they've allied themselves with.
I think we're getting off topic.
Lauren said, trying to prevent an argument.
What were you saying about those two?
Oh, right.
Habit said, reaching forward and grabbing another slice of pizza.
Remember what Firebrand said about Sebastian getting dragged off into the forest? He went through hell before he died. His punishment for resisting the big man was so bad that I don't think you'd ever want to see what's behind that mask he wears.
Habit bit into his food as he watched realization spread across her face.
That's right. Sebastian became Swain, the first member of the collective. He died trying to keep his journal out of the enemy's hands, but came back as something with the sole purpose of retrieving it.
As for Deadhead, well, he's an interesting case. His name was Lars Mueller, a Nazi soldier who'd been assigned to Project Oton alongside Sebastian. What set them apart is that Lars began working for the administrator willingly at some point before the event happened, and had a big hand in how it went down. That last bit of morality in Sebastian that pushed him to abandon his loyalty to the Third Reich and give the journal to Karl is something that never existed in his fellow soldier. Lars only cared about one thing, and that was power, which the administrator promised him in exchange for his services. After the event, he was given the same mission as Swain, and the Nazi known as Lars Mueller was no more. He became a completely different person with no loyalties to anyone other than the administrator. And he even started going by a different name, Henke Wiese. Henke went on to do a number of notable things, like being a founding member of the Order, that secret society I mentioned earlier. But for the most part, his mission remained the same, getting the journal from my grandfather. He was never successful, although he came close a few times, and he died in a last-ditch attempt to steal the journal from Karl, killing my grandmother in the process. In the end, the administrator kept his promise to Henke in exactly the way you'd expect. It granted him great power at the price of his free will, twisting him into the second member of the collective, Deadhead. I think you know how the story goes after that.
Lauren nodded her head, long past the point of being in disbelief.
I guess it's a good thing I didn't take his deal.
She joked, trying to manage a smile.
So, first there was Swain, then Deadhead, then Mr. Scars, Cursor, and the Observer.
Actually, the Observer's been possessing Kevin on and off since he was a child. He was created to be the collective's leader, after all, so he was keeping an eye on things long before he took Kevin over completely.
Right. But what about you?
She said, looking at Firebrand.
And the old guy, for that matter. He was in their group too.
Persilis is the Carl Maxwell from my own timeline. He spent so much time with Sebastian's journal in his possession that his essence became eternally bound to it. Something that didn't even happen to Sebastian himself.
He allowed Lauren a moment to come to terms with what he just said before continuing.
Carl's assimilation went the same way as most others. He died and then came back as one of them, but it was only after he gave me the journal that it was able to happen. As a result of his soul being bound to the journal, Persilis is able to follow the book across time and space and continues to manifest himself every time I reset the clock, regardless of the fact that Carl still lives in the present day.
So what would happen if Carl died in a new timeline? Would it create a second Persilis?
No, because there would be no need for two of them. Remember, the collective doesn't just exist on their own. The administrator creates each member to serve a specific purpose. With one Persilis already around, he has no use for this timeline's Carl beyond getting the journal from him. Whenever a new timeline's Carl dies, he simply allows him to stay dead.
Awful merciful of him. I'm surprised he doesn't torture the guy in the crawl space for eternity or something.
It's less about mercy and more about him having more important things to worry about. It's the same reason he tries to manipulate this timeline's Noah into getting the journal for him, instead of just assimilating him into the collective. One firebrand is enough of an annoyance, so having two of them around would be an absolute nightmare for him.
So with all that being said, what is your place in all of this?
Lauren asked again, looking at Firebrand.
Are you actually a future version of Noah, or are you just a parasite controlling his body?
She saw a look of amusement appear on Firebrand's face, and it took her a moment to realize how harsh her phrasing had sounded.
Sorry, I didn't mean it like that.
I can see how you would come to that conclusion, but no, that isn't the case. I am actually Noah Maxwell, just an augmented version of him that was granted some serious power by the administrator. You see, Lauren, I fell into the enemy's control long before getting a hold of Sebastian's journal, and it was entirely by luck that I managed to remain myself. The reason there's such variety in the way the collective's members undergo their metamorphosis, the reason that most of them possess dead vessels while the observer possesses a living one, is because the administrator is experimenting with his playthings, trying to create the perfect servant who can aid him flawlessly in all of his endeavors, including retrieving the journal. When it was my time to be assimilated, he offered me a choice. Go willingly and be rewarded for my efforts, or be taken by force and become another mindless drone in the collective's hive mind. I chose the former. And because I was cooperative, he didn't create a parasite to possess me. Instead, he changed me into something unnatural, something powerful. And while I was still myself, more or less, it came with the price of my free will. I was a slave for years, and I can assure you it was hell. But through it all, I remembered my hatred of him, my thirst for vengeance, the people I'd lost because of him, and the man I'd once been.
And then one day I came along and severed him from the enemy's control. I saw the potential for this one to become a massive pain in the ass for all Stick in the Mud. So I took it upon myself to do a little meddling of my own. That's why our friend here comes crawling back to me every time he has to reset the timeline. I'm his greatest ally in this fight.
As much as it pains me to say it, Habit is right. He's the reason I'm able to do what I've been doing, and he's been a valuable ally since the day he set me free. Because of that, I've been restoring his memories after each reset. Most of them, anyway.
Firebrand said, whispering the last part so that only Lauren could hear it.
He isn't my only ally, though. I've made some powerful friends over the course of this crusade.
Such as?
The Foundation.
Habit said, a grimace appearing on his face.
I've never been a fan of them. Tried to lock me up a few times before we all ended up as comrades in arms.
What is the Foundation?
The Foundation is a secret organization entrusted by governments worldwide with the task of protecting the civilian population from anomalous objects, entities, and phenomena. They're dedicated to the research and containment of anomalies, which includes keeping them away from the general public and out of enemy hands. They're the only ones in that business that I trust completely. All of the other organizations and factions are either incompetent, inefficient, or self-serving. The Global Occult Coalition is tolerable, but they have a tendency to be sloppy even on their best days. So I try to avoid them as much as possible.
I'm surprised the Foundation didn't try to contain you,
Lauren said, completely unfazed that organizations centered around supernatural phenomena existed. Of all the things she'd learned during this unexpected meeting, that was the most believable.
Let's just say I made a good first impression,
Firebrand said with a grin.
I did them a big favor a while back, and we've been working together ever since. They've been particularly helpful with suppressing information about the enemy. The last thing we need is more people getting involved in this nightmare.
They aren't doing a very good job of keeping him a secret, considering all of those old stories and myths are still floating around.
The thing about those myths and legends, Lauren, is they're so obscure that there really isn't a need to redact them or erase them from history. That, and there's a few people out there who we actually want to stumble across that information. Most people have never even heard of those old stories. And those who have, like the Order, aren't the kind of people you can deal with easily. Thankfully, those masked dipshits are pretty secretive, so there isn't much threat of an information leak from them. But the same can't be said about your ex-boyfriend, or a few of the others in his shoes. There's been a few notable groups and individuals who've tried to post about their experiences with Stick in the Mud online and reveal his existence to the general public, Noah being one of them. But the Foundation shut it down immediately, so now he and a few of the others just keep personal video diaries or some shit. I'm not sure what the point of that even is, but there's a few of them who've been doing it for a while now, my own vessel included.
That would explain the camcorder he had on the boardwalk.
I'm sure you can understand why people spreading the word about that fucker would be problematic for us. In this day and age, that would take off like wildfire, and the damage resulting from it would be incalculable. The more people that know about him, the further his influence will spread.
People nowadays just can't keep their mouths shut about anything. It's no wonder nobody can get away with crime anymore. They should take a lesson from your buddy Aaron. Now there's a guy who can keep a secret.
Wait, are you saying that he's involved in this too?
Lauren asked, her blood running cold. It would explain some of his strange behavior, like how he still refused to talk about his family after years of them being friends. And a lot of things about his past in general, for that matter. There was also the fact that he'd given her silver bullets for protection. She couldn't bear the thought of losing another one of her friends, especially after what she'd seen in the crawlspace. So Habit's words had been like a punch in the gut.
To an extent, yes. He's been on our radar for some time. But I fear that isn't a topic that we have time to delve into right now. Which is exactly why I asked you not to bring it up,
Firebrand said, glaring at Habit, who just shrugged and reached for another slice of pizza.
Try not to worry about him too much. He's more than capable of taking care of himself.
Lauren wanted to know more about what was going on with her friend, but Firebrand clearly wasn't going to elaborate any further. So, she begrudgingly went along with the change in topic.
Now, back to what we were talking about before we got so off track. When Habit freed me from my chains, my power grew exponentially without the limitations set by the Administrator. But it wasn't enough. The enemy couldn't control me anymore, but they were less than happy about Habit's little stunt. And I knew it wouldn't be long before they tracked me down and destroyed me. So I went to Carl, and when he was finally convinced that I was telling the truth, that we only had one option, he gave me the journal, sacrificing himself in the process. With this power, I became something with the strength to manipulate the fabric of time and space itself. Something with the ability to tear holes in dimensions and travel across them. An omnipotent being capable of breaking and fixing reality at will. Something that shouldn't exist.
A rogue god,
Habit drawled, having heard this speech many times before.
Using the power I gained from the journal, I reset the timeline and started anew. Now with a battle plan and the power to see it through. That was the day I started calling myself Firebrand.
Lauren had no words, electing to simply sit there and take in all of the new information. A few days ago, she would have admitted herself to the mental ward just for dreaming of any of this. But now that she'd personally witnessed demons, demigods, and alternate dimensions, it was all making sense to her.
Of course, our foes aren't entirely in the dark about what I'm doing. My meddling has comprised their clairvoyance. They can't see ahead or remember past timelines like I can, but they recognize the disturbances in the time continuum. Like me and Persilis existing long before we should. And there's other factors too, like their own future vision, but thankfully I'm able to counter it and only allow them to see ahead in a way that benefits us, not them. They aren't stupid. They know what's going on. They know I'm fucking with the timeline and they know what I'm using to do it, but they don't know how to stop me. They can only try and correct it, but I won't let them.
So that's your mission then? Save all of us, including your past self, and destroy the enemy?
Exactly,
Firebrand said with a grin.
And now that you're out of harm's way, we're one step closer to victory.
He paused for a moment, as if to collect his thoughts, closing his eyes in remembrance before opening them again and looking back at her.
We've come a long way from when this first began, you know? Back in those days, my plan was a lot different. I was trying to create a recursive timeline that branched off from the main one to act as an eternal prison for the Administrator and his collective. That was back when I never would have taken the risk of actually trying to destroy them. We called it the Alpha Timeline because it was supposed to be superior to all others.
You should have seen it, Lauren. It was wild!
Habit said with a big grin.
He had this whole thing set up with time travel fuckery. All kinds of paradoxes, and like 3 versions of Noah from different places in the timeline. 4 if you count Firebrand himself. It's a shame it all fell apart, because it was a ton of fun.
I'm guessing the plan didn't work?
No, it did work, but it wasn't enough. Certain outside factors that I wasn't yet aware of made it an impossible endeavor.
The Dark Realm.
Habit said gravely, nodding his head in affirmation.
At least you were able to steal Hellfire from the place before the reset, eh, Prometheus?
It has served me well over the years. It's a shame it's only powerful enough to wound the Administrator, not actually kill him. In any case, we really shouldn't be talking about this now. You need to be more careful about what you say, Habit.
Kiss my ass, Fireburnt. I'll say what I want.
Habit said, rolling up a new slice of pizza and biting into it. But after a moment, he relented, letting out a sigh of compliance.
I suppose you're right. Best not to fuck up the timeline by going off script.
Lauren wanted to know more about this dark realm that they'd mentioned, but after seeing the looks on their faces, she decided not to ask about it. However, she had a sneaking suspicion that it had something to do with whatever was beyond the border of the crawl space, for Firebrand had refused to talk about that as well.
Anyway, it was the failure of my original plan and the discoveries I made in the process that led to me resetting everything to enact my new mission. Destroying the enemy for good. I've reset the timeline more times than I could keep track of without my friend over there.
Firebrand said, gesturing to Skiniari.
And it's taken several lifetimes of work to get to where we are now, which I believe to be a perfected timeline in which our victory is certain. This is meant to be our last attempt at winning this game, and it will end in our favor. That's why we call it the Omega Timeline.
And if this one doesn't work either?
Then I reset the timeline and keep trying until our victory is secured. Just like the last few thousand times I've had to. They aren't powerful enough to stop me.
Firebrand said. Lauren wasn't sure if he was exaggerating about how many times he'd reset the timeline, and at this point, she was too unnerved by it to ask.
But it shouldn't come to that this time. We've worked hard to get to this point, and the course of events we've set in motion won't be easily undone.
So everything important that happens in these timelines are things that you've orchestrated?
Correct. It all has to play out a certain way or the timeline will branch off in a different direction than what's beneficial to us. And I don't think I need to explain why that would be bad. For example, when I discovered how important you were to the success of our mission, I made it a point to keep track of anyone significant that you acquainted yourself with, like Kate. The first time I witnessed her being hunted by the Administrator in that campground back in Michigan, I decided to help her out of pity alone. Because of that, it took much longer than it originally did for her to become a slave to the enemy, which triggered a chain of events that allowed us to shape the future in our favor, such as the two of you growing apart and not seeing much of each other for a few years, which, as you know, has brought us to where we are now. By keeping you out of harm's way for a few extra years, we were able to enact far more elaborate and effective plans than before. And so, ever since that first timeline, Me saving Kate has been a key point in our plan because of the opportunities it created for us.
I never even knew you helped Kate back then.
Indeed, I did. I was able to convince the administrator to give her a second chance at winning his little game that night. He knew what I was up to, of course, but his pride convinced him to toy with her for a little while longer, and it worked out in our favor. Just like it has every time since.
So it all boils down to a butterfly effect type of thing?
In a way, yes. But it's a much more controlled environment that we've been experimenting with and tweaking for a very long time to achieve the perfect outcome. Not to freak you out, but we've essentially taken control of your reality in order to stop the administrator.
I gathered. Not really sure how I feel about it, though. What about other realms, like the Candleverse and the Crawl Space? You said those exist beyond the limits of space and time, so are they resistant to things like timeline resets and memory wipes?
Nope. The power I wield trumps even that.
Firebrand said, looking noticeably smug about it.
So if you can do all of that, then why can't you just destroy the enemy by yourself and be done with it? I mean, it sounds like you outclass them in every way.
Don't make the mistake of underestimating them, Lauren. I may have the upper hand, but our enemy still harbors great power. I've come close to defeat several times, but they've never managed to land the killing blow. Soon, a day will come when their destruction is possible, but today is not that day. I may possess the means to disrupt his plans and dance around his tricks, but in terms of raw power, I'm afraid I don't compare to the administrator.
Jesus, how can something be that powerful? Speaking of that faceless asshole, what even is he?
It's hard to say, really. An anomaly in the fabric of space and time. A disruption of matter and energy, maybe. Nobody really fucking knows for sure. Hell, I'm not sure if the big man himself even knows. Whatever he is, he's racked up more than his fair share of identities over the years.
The administrator, the keeper, the suited man, Mr. Slim, Slender Man, Der Grossman, Gorelehatep. The names change. He doesn't. Some people even call him the Operator, but that is something else entirely.
His appearance changes too. And I mean aside from the occasional shape-shifting like what you saw earlier. His general look tends to stay the same. Tall, pale, and faceless. But I've seen his clothes change to reflect the time period he's in. And in case you were wondering, they're not actually clothes. They're part of his genetic makeup. If he even has genetics. Anyway, he's been wearing that black suit for a couple centuries now. But every few hundred years or so, he'll change it to look like something else. Usually something that fits in with whatever culture he hangs around the most. I remember in ancient Egypt, he had this fancy getup, like what you'd see one of the gods from those old myths wearing. And he had a thing for dressing like European royalty back in the days of the British Empire. Whatever it is, he usually goes for something with the appearance of wealth or higher standing. The general assumption is that it's to blend in with humans. But that doesn't make any sense, because he can just make himself invisible to anyone who doesn't want to see him. I think he's just a pretentious prick myself.
Huh. Well, that's good to know.
Lauren said, not sure what to do with this information. She hadn't gotten much of an answer at all on that one, but she wasn't sure what she'd expected to begin with.
He isn't a god, is he?
She asked, earning a burst of laughter from habit.
You humans are hilarious. The way you immediately try to explain what you don't understand as gods or magic. Any powerful being can just waltz in and claim to be a god, Lauren. That doesn't mean that they are one. More often than not, they're just some dickhead on a power trip trying to play a part, as is the case with our faceless friend.
Hey, speaking of magic, this is a little off topic, but what's the deal with that symbol I've been seeing everywhere? The one that looks like intersecting eyes. I've seen that thing do some really weird things.
The Rune of Severance. It isn't the only thing capable of defiling reality like that, but it is one of the most powerful sigils out there. And I can assure you, It's far from off topic.
What is it exactly?
It's exactly what I said. Severance. It's capable of a few different things, but all of its applications revolve around that central aspect. Think of how you've seen it used. Remember what your friends saw it do on the Matheson farm? How it severed the very fabric of reality to open a rift between dimensions? It didn't just create some fold in space-time for Charlie to travel between the cellar and the granary with Lauren. It actually opened a door to the crawl space. That's why both of those areas were so fucked up. Another reality was encroaching on your own.
Could it be used as some kind of locking mechanism too? Because that would explain how it was able to keep me trapped in Oakside Park.
You're damn right it can! The thing can be used in reverse too, but that's a difficult ability to master. Most who try just end up locking themselves out of whatever they were trying to open. In the case of something like that happening, it's still possible to break the seal by destroying the symbol, but that's easier said than done. The rune can be used as a weapon or defense mechanism in certain situations too, but keep in mind that its power comes from intent and can be extremely hard to master. That, and there's only so much you can do against entities as powerful as the big bad stick in the mud, especially if a mortal is using it.
Lauren would never know it, but several years prior, Carl had learned that very lesson the hard way after experimenting with the symbol himself. He'd carved it into a baseball bat the day he'd rescued Kate from Riverview Park, and had tried to use the weapon against the suited man not long after the fact, when it had finally decided to show itself to him again. Needless to say, it hadn't worked out well for Carl.
Wait, so you're saying that humans can use the rune too?
To a certain extent, yes. But you have to be careful with it. And don't just go around drawing it on anything, because the Observer and his little toadies like using it to spy on people. That's why it's shaped like intersecting eyes. Anything powerful enough can look through it like a literal window. All in all, the Rune of Severance can be used for a lot of different things, and it has even more uses than what I just listed off. But what matters most when utilizing it is intent. It's a powerful tool, Lauren. Don't underestimate its potential, or the threat it poses.
I hate to cut this short, but we're running out of time. This realm is starting to tear her apart,
Firebrand said, pointing to the blood that had just begun trickling from Lauren's nose.
There's a reason we went through the trouble of setting up this meeting. A reason beyond giving you a simple history lesson.
He's right. I wouldn't even be here if this wasn't important.
We're relaying this information to you because you're now a part of something much bigger than you could ever imagine, and your fight doesn't end here. Everything we've taught you tonight is information that you need to know going forward, because now you have a job to do, just like the rest of us.
A job? What kind of job?
Fight with us. Help us put an end to this son of a bitch once and for all. You may only be human, but you're a survivor. Most people couldn't make it through the things you have, even with a demigod's help. That makes you valuable to us, and dangerous to them.
Habit said, and Firebrand nodded in approval.
Are you willing to fight, Lauren? Because you aren't out of the line of fire just yet. And there's a lot of work to be done before this mission can be completed.
Is that even a question? Of course I'm willing to fight. I want this bastard dead just as much as you do.
Lauren said, beginning to feel lightheaded.
Good!
Habit said with a big smile, tossing the now empty pizza box over his shoulder and rubbing his hands together excitedly.
This feels like the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
I doubt that,
Lauren commented, earning more laughter from the purple-eyed possessor.
Now that we're all on the same page, it's time to send you back where you belong. The Candleverse isn't meant for mortals,
Firebrand said. He wasn't kidding. Lauren had been feeling worse by the second ever since her nose had started bleeding. A fierce migraine was now ripping through her skull, making it hard to focus on anything.
Thank you, Firebrand. For everything.
She managed to say through the pain.
And you too, Habit.
She begrudgingly added, still unsure of whether she could trust this entity or not.
Hey, that's what friends are for. Now then, you have overstayed your welcome, Miss Jones. It's time for me to have a few drinks, chase myself around the room, and play hard to get.
On that note, Habit reached across the table and touched her forehead. and she felt herself beginning to fade into unconsciousness.
We'll meet again soon, Lauren. You aren't alone in this fight. You never were.
Firebrand said, a warm smile appearing on his face.
Yep, now fuck off.
Habit cackled. The last thing she saw was the deep purple glow coming from his eyes, as their world once again faded to black. Thank you for listening to Blood and Venom, written by Arthur Faraday, under the username WoodMr13, distributed on Archive of Our Own. Season 2 of FanScape has been funded by the Nevada Arts Council and the National Endowment of the Arts. Starring Aubrey Lima as Lauren Jones and young Charlie, Cathryn Archer as Kate Milens, David Klein II as the narrator, Xander Grant as Carl Ross, Chris Maconaughey as the Slender Man, Liam Delane as Habit. Guest starring Vincent C. Davis as the Observer, Jamie Petronas as Firebrand, Harlan Guthrie as the introduction narrator. Intro and credits music created by Dylan Griggs. Special thanks to our fellow podcasting friends who have helped make Season 2 possible at Malevolent, Through the Fog, The Impala Films, creators of Haunted and audio drama, Woe Begone, The Morbid Forest, and our friends at World Beyond and Jabun Audio. Before we end the episode, I just want to take a moment to say that while Season 2 of FanScape was funded by a grant, future seasons will be done so out of pocket. This show has a high production cost, and any assistance you can give, be it by sharing FanScape with a friend, or by joining our Patreon or Ko-Fi, or even buying merch to help fund the show financially, would be greatly appreciated and will help make Season 3 come sooner rather than later. Links for this and everything else mentioned in the credits can be found in the description or at thefanscape.com. Thank you for listening.